The notice was nailed to the door of the Dust Creek General Store on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and Kate Rhodes read it 3 times before she fully understood what it meant for her life. She had arrived in Dust Creek, Texas, just 4 months prior, following her late father's dream of a homestead claim in the Western Territories. Her father, Thomas Rhodes, had filed the claim before he passed from a fever that winter, and Kate had honored his memory by making the journey herself. A 26-year-old woman traveling alone from Missouri with nothing more than a wagon, a mule named Chester, and a deed to 80 acres of rocky, beautiful land on the edge of Comanche Creek. She had worked those 80 acres through the coldest weeks of the year, turning soil and mending fences, making the little cabin her father had started into something that resembled a home. She had done all of this without complaint, without fear, and without asking a single soul in Dust Creek for anything beyond supplies on credit. And now this. The notice, printed in the iron-pressed letters of the Territorial Land Office, stated in plain and merciless language that under the 1875 Texas Homestead provision, a single woman without a male guardian or legal husband could not maintain an independent land claim within the Comanche Creek territory. The provision had been amended the previous fall, Kate learned, after 2 widows had sold their claims to a cattle baron named Harlan Pruitt, who then used the consolidated land to divert water rights from smaller ranchers. The men of the county commissioner's office, in their wisdom, had decided the best solution was not to stop Harlan Pruitt, but to prevent single women from holding claims at all. The notice further stated, in a postscript that felt almost casual in its cruelty, that any woman currently holding such a claim had exactly 72 hours to either secure a legal marriage or vacate the property, at which point the claim would revert to the territory and be made available for public auction. Kate stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of the general store for a long moment, the morning sun warm on her face, the dust of the main street swirling around her boots. She was not a woman given to tears in public. She had not cried when her father died. She had not cried when her wagon lost a wheel 12 miles outside of Abilene, and she had to repair it herself in the dark. She was not going to cry now, on a Tuesday morning in front of Hector Greer's general store, because some men in an office somewhere had decided her life needed managing. What she felt, more than grief, was fury. She folded the notice and put it in the pocket of her canvas work coat and walked down the main street of Dust Creek with the steady, purposeful stride that people in town had already come to associate with her. Dust Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery stable, a post office that shared space with a barber shop, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a church that was also used for town meetings, and a handful of homes belonging to the families who had settled there over the past decade. It also had, as of 8 months ago, a ranch house about 2 miles north of town that belonged to a man named George Hayes. Kate knew of George Hayes the way she knew of most people in Dust Creek, which is to say she knew his name, his reputation, and approximately what he looked like from seeing him in passing at the store or at the one town meeting she had attended in January. He was a rancher, 31 years old, who had come to Comanche Creek from Arkansas 4 years prior and built up a working cattle operation that the other ranchers spoke of with a combination of respect and mild envy. He was tall, dark-haired, not given to much talk in public, and he had a reputation for being fair with his hired hands and honest at the trading post. He had also, as far as Kate was aware, never been married, which made him one of the few eligible men in the county who was not already spoken for, considerably older than her or Harlan Pruitt. She pushed open the door of the Red Lantern because the saloon was where information lived in a town like Dust Creek, and she needed information. The morning crowd in the Red Lantern was sparse. 2 old men played checkers at a table near the window. The barkeep, a heavy-set man named Dutch, looked up from wiping glasses with the expression of a man who had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. "Miss Rhodes," he said. "Dutch," she said. "I need to know who posted that notice on Hector's door." Dutch set down the glass. "Land office boys rode through yesterday afternoon. Posted one at the store, one at the church, one at the post office." "How many women in this county does it affect?" Dutch scratched the back of his neck. "Far as I know, just you. Clara Whitfield has her claim in her son's name since her husband passed. Maggie Torres has been living on her claim jointly with her brother since '83. Far as I know, you are the only single woman holding an independent claim in the county." So it was, in practical terms, aimed at her specifically. She did not know whether that was by design or merely by coincidence, but the effect was the same. "Thank you, Dutch," she said, and walked back out into the morning sun. She stood in the street and thought clearly and methodically, the way her father had taught her to think when a problem seemed large. Break it into its pieces. What are the actual facts? The facts were, she had 72 hours. She needed to be married within that time or lose everything her father had ever worked toward. She was not willing to lose it. Therefore, she needed to find a man willing to marry her within 72 hours. The list of candidates was short. Dutch was already married. Hector Greer was 62, and his hands shook so badly he could barely make change. The pastor, Reverend Mills, was a man of God and also already married. There were a handful of cowboys who worked the various ranches, but she did not know any of them well enough to approach with something this serious, and she was not desperate enough to throw herself at a stranger just because he had a hat and a pulse. Which brought her, almost inevitably, back to George Hayes. She asked Dutch, because Dutch knew everything, where she might find him at this hour. Dutch told her that George Hayes had a habit of coming into town on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to pick up supplies and check for post. It was, Dutch said with a glance at the clock above the bar, about 20 minutes until he usually arrived. Kate went to the general store, bought a small bag of coffee beans she did not particularly need, and sat on the bench outside Hector's door to wait. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to be pathetic about this. She was not going to beg. She was going to make a businesslike proposition to a man she had assessed as being reasonable and fair, and she was going to give him the opportunity to help her, and if he said no, she would think of something else. She did not know what that something else would be, but she would think of it when she got there. George Hayes arrived at 9:20 on a bay horse with a white blaze, and he was exactly as she remembered him from their 2 or 3 brief exchanges. Tall and broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rock as the Comanche Creek Canyon walls, and dark brown eyes that swept the street with the quiet alertness of a man who spent most of his time alone and had learned to pay attention to his surroundings. He wore a tan duster over a blue cotton shirt, work boots, and a hat so broken in that it had conformed entirely to the shape of his head. He did not look like a man who would be moved by a scene. Good. She was not planning to make one. He tied his horse at the post in front of the general store and saw her sitting on the bench. He stopped walking, not dramatically, just the brief pause of a man recalibrating his expectations for the morning. "Miss Rhodes," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and unhurried, with the Arkansas drawl worn smooth by years of disuse. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes. It is a rather unusual matter." He looked at her for a moment. Not unkindly, but directly, the way a man looks when he is trying to understand the weight of what is being said. "I have time," he said. She stood up, and they walked to the end of the sidewalk where the street thinned out and there was a little space between the store and the livery stable, away from the 2 old men who had drifted to the window of the Red Lantern, with their checkers game forgotten in favor of watching. Kate had spent enough time in small towns to know that anything she said within earshot of anyone would be general knowledge by sundown, and while she could not prevent that entirely, she could at least make the effort. She told him everything directly. She was not a woman who dressed things up when plain speaking would do. She explained the notice, the provision, the 72 hours. She told him that she was aware this was an extraordinary thing to ask of a man she barely knew. She told him that she was not asking him to fall in love with her or change his life beyond the legal fact of a marriage, and that she understood if he had arrangements or plans of his own that made this impossible. She said that she would understand completely if he said no, and that she was asking him first because the people of Dust Creek spoke well of him, and she had no reason to think he was dishonest. When she finished, she folded her hands in front of her and waited. George Hayes had listened to the entire thing without interrupting, which she noted. He had looked at her steadily throughout. He looked at her now in the thin shadow between the two buildings with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read. "How much do you know about me?" he said at last. "Your name, your ranch, your reputation for dealing honestly, not much beyond that. And you came to me because of the reputation." "Partly. And because, as far as I can determine, you are the only man in Dust Creek of roughly appropriate age who is not already married." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Roughly appropriate age," he repeated. "You are 31, I am 26. That seems reasonable to me." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "I will marry you, Miss Rhodes." She had been prepared for this to go either way, but hearing it said so directly still created a peculiar sensation in her chest that she chose to interpret as relief. "You do not want time to consider it." "I considered it while you were talking," he said. "It is the right thing to do. What you are being asked to comply with is not just. The least a man can do is not stand by and watch a woman lose her home because of an unjust law." Kate looked at him for a moment. She had expected practicality. She had not expected that particular framing. "I appreciate that, Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "but I want to be clear that this would be a legal arrangement. I'm not asking you to take on a wife in the full sense." "I heard you the first time," he said, still with that quiet evenness that was neither cold nor warm. "But marriages are not always what they start as. I am willing to let that be what it becomes." She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing, which seemed to be acceptable. "I will speak to Reverend Mills this morning," George said. "We can be married by tomorrow if he can arrange it." "The 3 days run out on Thursday evening," Kate said. "We have until then." "Then I see no reason to wait until Thursday," he said. It was logical. It was also, she thought, the action of a man who did not want to give her time to change her mind, though she was not sure whether that was because he wanted to be married to her or because he was the kind of man who decided on a course of action and executed it before doubt could complicate it. She suspected the latter. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." She expected him to tip his hat and go into the store. Instead he said, "Come with me to see Reverend Mills now. It is better to arrange it in person." So she did. Reverend Mills was a thin man with kind eyes and the pragmatic acceptance of a frontier pastor who had long since made peace with the fact that the West produced circumstances that did not align neatly with the ideals of a Sunday sermon. He heard them out, looked at them both with a thoughtful expression, and said he could perform the ceremony at 10 o'clock the following morning. He did not ask them to explain themselves further. He simply wrote it in his book and offered them both coffee. Kate accepted the coffee. George did not. As they left the church, walking side by side down the dirt path between the gate and the road, Kate became acutely aware that she was going to marry this man tomorrow and that she did not know, for instance, what his middle name was or whether he had any family living or what he took in his coffee. "This is strange," she said. "Stranger things happen," he said. "I suppose they do." She paused at the road. Her wagon was tied 2 buildings down. "Mr. Hayes, since we are going to be married tomorrow, perhaps we could have a proper conversation this afternoon. At the store, or wherever is convenient. Just so that we are not entirely strangers." He looked at her with that same steady, appraising look. "I would prefer that," he said, and it came out sounding almost like an admission. "I close up at the ranch around 5. I could come back to town. There is a table at Dutch's that is quieter than the others." 5 o'clock then, Kate said. She spent the rest of the day in a state that she would not have called nervousness, exactly, because that felt too small a word for something so large, and too dramatic a word for something she had decided to approach with practical calm. She went back to her homestead and worked through the afternoon with the focused determination of someone who needed their hands busy in order to keep their thoughts ordered. She mended a section of fence along the east pasture. She checked on Chester, who was aging but still serviceable. She looked at the cabin, which she had worked so hard on, the new boards she had replaced on the south wall, the curtain she had sewn from a piece of blue muslin, the cast-iron stove she had purchased and hauled on her own from the trading post in Abilene, and she felt the particular ache of someone who has built something with their own hands and understands precisely what is at stake. She would not lose this. She had made that decision. Everything else was a matter of execution. She changed into her second-best dress for the meeting at 5, which was a deep blue wool that had been her mother's and which fit her nearly perfectly after a few adjustments. She braided her dark red hair back neatly. She was not trying to be beautiful. She was trying to be respectable. There was a difference, she thought, though as she looked in the small square mirror above the washstand, she allowed that the dress did not hurt. The table at the Red Lantern that George had referred to was in the back corner, shielded from the main room by a half partition that Dutch had put up years ago for card games that didn't want an audience. When Kate arrived at 5 past 5, George was already there with 2 cups of coffee, and she noted that he had also changed his shirt, which was now a deep green cotton that fit him better than the morning one. She sat across from him. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "I'll start," she said. "My name is Catherine Ann Rhodes. I am 26 years old. My father was Thomas Rhodes, a farmer from Missouri. My mother was Frances Aldridge before she married, and she died when I was 11. My father died this past December of a fever. I'm an only child. I am in good health. I can cook, preserve, sew, garden, and do basic carpentry and repair. I have $30 saved. I have no debts beyond a small account at Hector's store. I am not promised to anyone anywhere. I have no vices beyond a fondness for strong coffee and a tendency to argue when I believe I am right. That is the honest account." George was quiet for a moment, and then something genuinely shifted in his face, and what had moved at the corner of his mouth in the morning finally became a full smile, brief but real, warm in a way that caught her slightly off guard. "George William Hayes," he said, 31 years old, born in Fayetteville, Arkansas. My father was Robert Hayes, a circuit judge. My mother was Eleanor Calloway before she married. She is still living in Fayetteville. My father passed when I was 22, and I came west 2 years later because the land in Arkansas was too full of other men's opinions about who I ought to be. I have a younger sister, Clara, who is married to a lawyer and lives well. I have been ranching here for 4 years. I have 40 head of cattle, 12 horses, 2 ranch hands named Eli and Sam who I pay fairly and who would do anything for me, which I consider a better measure of a man than most. I have $200 saved. I have no debts. I can cook minimally, which is to say I will not poison you, but I am better with horses and cattle than with a stove. I have been engaged once before in Arkansas when I was 24, and she chose another man instead, and I decided afterward that I was not in a hurry to try that again. I am not a man who talks a great deal in public, but I am told I am a better talker in private. I have no vices that I am aware of, though I am sure I have faults I cannot see from the inside." Kate listened to this, all of it. When he finished, she said, "The woman in Arkansas, does that still pain you?" He considered the question without apparent discomfort. "No, I think at the time it felt like it would, but it turned out she was right about us. We were not well matched. I was trying to be something I was not in that life." "What were you trying to be?" "A judge's son who stayed close to home and became what his father was." He picked up his coffee cup. "I am something else. I am still finding out what." Kate looked at him across the table in the warm, low light of the Red Lantern and thought that this was, despite everything, a remarkable thing. She had come here to make a practical arrangement, And here was this man being honest with her in a way that most men she had known were not honest even with themselves. "The engagement did not break you," she said. "It was not a question." "No, it clarified me." He paused. "You came west alone after your father died. That is not a small thing." It was what he wanted. The claim was in his name, but it was our dream together. He always said the land was the only thing worth working for because it was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you. She paused. "The irony of that is not lost on me." "It is not being taken," he said with a firmness that surprised her. "Not if I have anything to say about it." They talked for 2 hours, not about the marriage or the legal arrangement, but about everything else. About the land, about the creek that ran through the bottom of her property and the color of it in the evening when the sun was low. About his cattle operation and the particular horse he was proudest of. A gray gelding named Smoke, who had cost him more than any horse should and been worth every cent. About Missouri and Arkansas and what it meant to leave a place, and whether leaving was running or choosing, and how you knew the difference. About books. Kate had brought 7 books from Missouri and had read each of them twice. George had a crate of books at the ranch that he said he worked through slowly, one at a time, like a man pacing himself on a long road. At 7 o'clock, Dutch put a plate of cornbread and beans on the table between them without being asked, and they ate while they talked, and Kate thought that she had not had a conversation this good in 4 months of near solitude, and that it was both welcome and slightly alarming. When the clock above the bar read 8:30, she said she should go. He walked her to her wagon. The main street of Dust Creek was quiet in the blue dark of the spring evening, a few lanterns burning in windows, the smell of wood smoke and horse, and the faint green smell that came off the creek. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said, gathering Chester's reins. I will be there, he said. He stood with one hand resting on the side of her wagon, not casual exactly, but settled the way a man stands when he is comfortable with a silence. Miss Rhodes, I want you to know something. She looked at him. I am not doing this only because it is the right thing, he said. I mean to say that it is also the right thing for me. I am 31 years old and I have been alone on that ranch for 4 years, and I have been telling myself that I preferred it. And last night when I was coming into town, I was thinking that the best thing about Tuesdays was that they gave me a reason to come to town. So this is not entirely a sacrifice. Kate was quiet for a moment. The lantern from the saloon behind him caught the edge of his face, the line of his jaw, the seriousness in his eyes. I appreciate you telling me that, she said at last. I am going to think about it. I would not expect anything else, he said, and stepped back from the wagon. She drove home through the warm spring dark with the stars coming out overhead in great spreading arcs, and Chester plodding along the familiar road with the patience of an animal who has made this journey many times and sees no need for haste. She thought about what George Hayes had said, not the first part about it being right. She had expected that from him. The second part, about Tuesdays, about being alone and telling himself he preferred it. She knew that feeling. She had been telling herself the same thing for 4 months, and before that, for 2 years of caring for her father while his health declined, a period during which her world had contracted to the dimensions of a sick man's room, and she had convinced herself that the contraction was temporary and that she was fine. She was fine. But she was also, she admitted to the stars and Chester and the dark road, lonely. Whether that changed anything about tomorrow remained to be seen. She slept poorly but deeply in the way that exhaustion produces, and woke before dawn to the sound of mockingbirds in the oak tree outside the cabin window. She lay still for a while and thought about the day. Then she got up and washed her face and braided her hair with the blue ribbon she had saved from her mother's sewing box, and put on the dress she had carefully pressed the night before, a pale cream cotton with small embroidered flowers at the cuffs that had been her mother's good dress, and that she had brought from Missouri without being entirely sure she would ever wear it in Texas. She put on her boots, which were good boots even if they were work boots, and looked at herself in the small mirror. Well, Mother, she said quietly to the reflection, which had her mother's jaw and her father's eyes, and that complicated mixture of the two of them that she had been carrying her whole life. This is not what either of us imagined. She drove Chester to town at 9. The morning was clear and warm, with a smell of spring grass and the distant sweet tang of the creek in bloom, and the hills to the west were a pale gold in the early light. It was, she thought despite herself, a beautiful day for something that was supposed to be purely practical. George was outside the church when she arrived, and he had done something she had not expected, which was bring flowers. Not elaborate flowers, not the kind purchased from a shop because there was no shop. These were wildflowers, a handful of Indian paintbrush and yellow goldenrod, and a sprig of something white she could not name, tied together with a piece of twine, and he was holding them with the careful, slightly self-conscious manner of a man who had decided to do something thoughtful and was now second-guessing whether it was too much. It was not too much. It was, in fact, the precise amount of much that made Kate's carefully maintained composure waver slightly, in the way that unexpected kindness is always more destabilizing than expected unkindness. "You brought flowers," she said. "It seemed like the kind of thing a person ought to do," he said, and held them out to her. She took them. She looked down at them for a moment. Indian paintbrush and goldenrod, the colors of the Texas hill country, the colors she had been looking at for 4 months from her cabin window. She thought about what it meant that he had gone out this morning before coming to town and picked these from the fields, which she knew because there was no other way to get them, and she thought that whatever else George Hayes was, he was a man who paid attention. "Thank you," she said. "These are from the lower meadow, aren't they?" "The one near the creek." He looked at her with what she was starting to recognize as surprise, the particular look of a man who is not often surprised. "You know the lower meadow. I ride that way sometimes in the evenings. It is the prettiest part of the valley." "It is," he agreed, and held the church door open for her. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth. There were witnesses because Texas law required 2, and Dutch had come along in his clean shirt, which moved Kate unexpectedly, and Hector Greer had closed the store for 30 minutes to come as well, which was apparently unprecedented. Hector cried a little, which he denied afterward when Dutch teased him about it. The ceremony itself was simple: words and promises and the formal legal record in the Reverend's book. When it came to the part of the ring, George reached into his coat pocket and produced a plain gold band that was worn smooth with age. "It was my mother's second ring," he said quietly, "meant for her alone. She sent it with me when I left, said to use it when the right time came. I sent her a letter this morning to tell her the time came. The smallest pause. I hope that is acceptable." Kate looked at the ring, at his hand holding it, steady and careful, at his face, which was serious and earnest in the way that it was not often earnest in public. "It is very acceptable," she said, and held out her hand. When the ring was on her finger, she looked down at it and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what had been done. Not the practical weight of the claim and the land and the 72 hours, but the other weight, the human weight of a promise made and received, even one entered into under the particular pressures of the West in 1878. After the ceremony, outside in the bright morning sun, Dutch shook George's hand and told him he had done right. Hector hugged Kate with the stiff awkwardness of a man who did not often hug people, patted her shoulder, and went back to open the store. Reverend Mills shook both their hands, told them God blessed unlikely beginnings more often than people thought, and went back inside to write up the legal documents. Kate and George stood on the church path alone for a moment. "Well," said Kate. "Well," said George. "I have a homestead claim to maintain," she said, "and I imagine you have cattle and horses to attend to." "I do," he said, "but I would like to take you to dinner this evening if you are willing. Not at Dutch's. I can cook. Minimally, as I said, but I have a decent hand at a few things, and the ranch house is large enough that you are not obligated to feel crowded by it." She considered this. She had, at some point between last night's conversation and this morning's ceremony, moved from thinking of this as a purely practical arrangement to thinking of it as something she was curious about. Not committed to in the romantic sense, not yet, but curious about. She was an honest person, and she was not going to pretend to herself that she did not find George Hayes interesting. "Tonight then," she said. She went home and worked through the afternoon in the same way as the day before, but with a different feeling underscoring it. Less the desperate energy of someone racing against a deadline and more the steady energy of someone who has bought time and is now deciding what to do with it. The land was hers, legally now, because she was Mrs. Hayes, and the world was very different from how it had been 48 hours ago. She also thought about what George had said. That he was willing to let the marriage be what it became. That it was the right thing for him, not only for her. She had not dismissed those words the way she would have dismissed them from a man she found dull or disingenuous. George Hayes was neither. She arrived at the ranch house at 6, driving Chester up the long straight track between two stands of live oak trees that formed a natural corridor leading to the main house and its outbuildings. The ranch was larger and more established than she had imagined. The main house was built from limestone, which was unusual and good, with a wide front porch and real glass windows that caught the evening light. Beyond it was a large wooden barn, a smaller structure she took for the bunkhouse, a fenced paddock with 4 horses moving quietly in the dusk, and in the distance, the dark shapes of cattle on a gentle rise. It was, she thought, a well-made thing. A man had built this with intention and care. George met her at the porch steps. He took Chester's reins and tied them to the post with the easy familiarity of a man who did this with horses several times a day. He looked at her for a moment in the evening light. "You came," he said, as though he had not been entirely certain. "I said I would," she said. "You did." He had made a beef stew, which was good, genuinely good, with onions and root vegetables and cornbread on the side, and coffee that was strong and fresh. The kitchen was serviceable and clean, which she noted, because a man who kept his kitchen clean was a man who respected the space he inhabited. They ate at the kitchen table because the dining room was used, he told her, mostly to store boxes of books and rope, which made her laugh properly for the first time in the 2 days she had known him. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the last light left the sky, and the stars came out, and the ranch settled into its night sounds of horses and crickets and the wind in the oaks. George brought 2 cups of coffee and they sat in the wooden chairs that looked out over the pasture, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence immediately. "I should tell you," Kate said at last, "that I am not accustomed to being helped." "I noticed," he said without edge, "just observation. I have been on my own in practical terms for longer than just since my father died. He was sick for 2 years before that, and I was the one managing the household and the land. I became very self-sufficient. There is nothing wrong with that. No, but it means I sometimes find it difficult to let people in. I find it difficult to trust that something is what it appears to be." She looked out at the dark pasture, the pale shapes of the horses against the grass. "What you are doing for me is generous, and I am not used to generosity that does not come with a cost." George was quiet for a moment. "Some generosity does not come with a cost," he said. "Some of it is just what people owe each other. You believe that. I was raised to believe it by a judge who spent his career watching what happened when people stopped believing it." He paused. "I know this arrangement is unusual. I know you did not choose me the way a person chooses in ordinary circumstances. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. But I meant what I said last night. I am not doing this out of pity. I am doing it because I think you are worth knowing, and because I would rather have you as my wife under imperfect circumstances than not know you at all." Kate turned to look at him. The porch light was just a single kerosene lantern on the railing between them, and it cast his face in warm gold and shadow. He was looking out at the pasture rather than at her, which she thought was deliberate, the same way a man will look away from something to make it easier to say. "You are very direct," she said. "It saves time." "Yes, it does." She held her coffee cup in both hands and thought for a moment about what she was feeling and whether it was something she was willing to name yet. She was not. But it was something, and it was growing, and she was not going to ignore it because it made things complicated. "I am going to stay on my homestead," she said, "for now. I need you to understand that." "I do understand it," he said. "I would not ask you to do otherwise. It is your land and it is your work. But I would like to come here for dinner on Thursdays," she said, "and perhaps on Sundays." He looked at her now. "Thursdays and Sundays," he said, "and you are welcome to come to the homestead whenever you have occasion to be in that direction, which is a standing invitation." "I ride that direction fairly often," he said. "I know. I have seen your tracks near the lower fence line." She smiled. "I thought I had a neighbor who was curious about my property." He looked at her steadily. "I was curious about you," he said. "I have been since you arrived. A woman who fences her own land and repairs her own wagon and argues with the feed merchant about the quality of his corn. I was curious." "And now," Kate said, "now I am married to her, which is considerably better than curious." She laughed again, and the sound of it surprised them both, light and genuine in the warm night air. It was the kind of laugh that comes from being unexpectedly happy, and she let herself have it. Over the next 3 weeks, a rhythm developed between them that felt natural in the way that only things which suit two people's true natures feel natural. Kate came to the ranch on Thursdays and Sundays. George rode past the homestead nearly every day, sometimes stopping briefly to check the fence line on the land that bordered his own, sometimes staying long enough for coffee, sometimes just raising a hand from horseback as he went by. It was unhurried and unpressured, and it was also, Kate thought, the most interesting thing that had happened to her in a long time. She learned things about him the way she had always preferred to learn things, by watching and listening rather than asking directly. And what she learned confirmed and expanded on what she had already suspected. He was patient in the way that competent people are patient, the patience of someone who has learned that most things worth doing take longer than expected. He was generous with his hands, meaning that when he saw something that needed doing, he did it, without comment or expectation of acknowledgement. When she arrived for dinner one Thursday to find that he had ridden over to her homestead the day before and replaced the cracked timber on her south fence without telling her in advance, she felt something warm and specific move through her chest that she had been trying to keep organized and compartmentalized for the past 10 days. She told him it was unnecessary. He told her he had spare timber and it was on his way. She told him she was capable of replacing her own fence. He told her he knew that perfectly well, but that being capable of a thing did not obligate you to do it alone when there was someone nearby who was capable of helping. She had no good argument for that, so she stopped arguing about the fence and thanked him properly instead, and the look on his face when she did was the look of a man who has received something small that means a great deal to him. She thought about that look for the entire ride back to her homestead. The first time he came to the homestead for dinner was the Sunday 3 weeks after the wedding, and he arrived with a crate that contained 3 bottles of wine he had apparently been saving since he came from Arkansas, a loaf of bread from Clara Whitfield, who had heard about the wedding and declared George Hayes the best man in the county, and a small carved wooden box that he set on the table without explanation, and then seemed to forget was there. She made a proper roast with the last of the winter root vegetables and fresh spring greens from the garden, and they ate at her small table by the cabin window, with the last evening light coming through the blue muslin curtains. And it felt, she thought, like something that had been happening for years, which was either very comfortable or very significant and possibly both. He noticed the books on the shelf above the fireplace while she was clearing the table. She had 7, as she had told him, and he looked at them with the same careful attention he gave to most things. "You have Middlemark," he said. "I do. I have been trying to find a copy for 2 years. He turned to look at her. "How did it end for you?" "Honestly," she said, perhaps more honestly than a person wants an ending to go when they are in the middle of a thing themselves. He looked at her steadily. Are you in the middle of a thing yourself? She came and stood beside him at the bookshelf, which was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the small cabin room, and she looked at the spines of her 7 books and thought about what she was going to say. She had been thinking about it for days, the question of when to say what was true and how to say it without overstating it, because she was not by nature a person who overstated. I think I might be, she said. I am not entirely sure yet. I am still observing. That sounds like you, he said, with a warmth in his voice that she was beginning to think about even when he was not there. I suppose it does. She turned to look at him, which meant looking up slightly because he was taller and finding his eyes, which were dark and careful and present in the way they always were. George, I want to say something and I want to say it plainly. All right, he said. When I came to you on Tuesday morning with the notice and the practical problem and the list of reasons, I was not thinking about anything beyond solving the immediate situation. I was not thinking about you as a person. I was thinking about you as a potential solution. I understood that at the time, he said. I know you did, but I want you to know that is not how I am thinking now. She paused. I am thinking about you as a person, quite a lot in fact, more than I expected to. The look on his face was not triumphant, which she had half feared. It was something quieter and deeper, the look of a man receiving something he had hoped for but not assumed. More than you expected, he said. Considerably more. He reached out and touched her hand, which was resting against the bookshelf, and the touch was very gentle and very deliberate, his fingers covering hers, and she felt it from her hand to the center of her chest like the first warm day of spring, sudden and complete. I have been thinking about you as a person, he said, since before you sat down on that bench outside Hector's store. She laughed, which she had not expected to, and then he laughed too, and then they were both laughing in the small, warm cabin in the lamplight, which was, she thought, the best possible outcome for a conversation she had been rehearsing in her head for a week. He took her hand properly then, held it in both of his, and she looked at him and felt with a clarity that surprised her by its simplicity that she trusted this man. Not in the measured, cautious way she trusted most people, with conditions and qualifications, but in the bone-deep way that she had trusted her father and her mother's memory and the permanence of the land. It was not a feeling she had expected to arrive so quickly or so definitely, and she was not going to argue with it. George, she said. Kate, he said, which was the first time he had used her first name, and he did it the way he did most things, deliberately and without fanfare, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She leaned up and kissed him, which was what she had been wanting to do for at least a week and had been organizing reasons against, and he kissed her back in a way that told her clearly that he had also been wanting it and also been finding reasons against it, and that they had both been slightly foolish about the whole thing. Outside the cabin, the spring dark was warm and full of stars, and the creek was singing over its stones, and inside, the lamp cast a gold circle of warmth on the table and the bookshelf, and the two people who had begun this story with a practical problem, and a notice nailed to a door, and were ending this part of it with their hands and their mouths, and the long, bright discovery of each other. They sat on the porch afterward for a long time, her shoulder against his arm, his hand over hers on the porch railing, looking at the stars and talking about everything, and nothing with the easy pleasure of two people who have just confirmed that they are going to know each other for a very long time. I want to tell you something, George said at some point when the night had grown deep and the frogs had started up down by the creek. Tell me. I was not going to come to town that Tuesday. I had supplies enough and I told myself I would wait until Thursday, but I was restless and I could not settle to anything in the morning and I thought the ride would do me good. He was quiet for a moment. I have thought about that since, about how close it came to going differently. Kate considered this. I would have found another way, she said, which was true. I know you would have. His thumb moved across her knuckles. But I am glad it was me. So am I, she said. She did not go back that night. and in the morning they rode together over the land that ran between his ranch and her homestead, in the early gold of the spring sunrise, on his horse and her mule, which was somewhat ungainly, but Chester was the best she had, and George did not seem to mind, and he showed her where the property lines ran, and where the creek came up closest to both claims, and she told him about the plans she had for the south field, and he told her his plans for expanding the herd. And it felt, in the most uncomplicated and satisfying way, like a partnership. In June, they made the arrangement more official, not in law, since they were already legally married, but in the practical sense of life. Kate moved into the ranch house. She did not give up her homestead. The claim remained in both their names now, legally secure, and they worked it together, Kate managing the kitchen garden and the smaller livestock, George incorporating the acreage into his range. The cabin stayed standing, maintained and clean, and sometimes she went there alone in the evenings to read or to think, and George understood this without needing it explained, which was one of the many things she had come to love about him. She had started using that word privately. Love. Not yet aloud, not in the way that made it final and formal, but inside herself where she could look at it honestly. She loved the way he moved through the world, with that particular combination of quiet confidence and genuine consideration. She loved that he sent regular letters to his mother in Arkansas, and that he kept her letters tied with a ribbon in the drawer of his desk. She loved that he had opinions about books, and that his opinions were different from hers, and that arguing about books over the dinner table had become the best part of her evenings. She loved the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, which was often, with an expression of such unguarded warmth that it sometimes made her breath catch. She said it out loud for the first time on a Tuesday in July, which she thought was appropriate. She had ridden to town to pick up supplies, and he had ridden with her, and on the way home they had stopped at the lower meadow where the Indian paintbrush grew, because it was still in bloom and the light on it was extraordinary, and they had let the horses graze while they sat by the creek, and she had been watching him skip stones on the water with the concentration of a man who takes stone skipping seriously, and she had thought, I love this man, and then she had thought, there is no reason not to say it. And so she had said it. He had turned around from the creek and looked at her with the surprised, careful expression she was very fond of. Then he had crossed the few feet between them and sat down beside her on the grass and taken her face in his hands and said, I have been in love with you since before you sat on that bench outside Hector's store, and I have been holding it back because I did not want to frighten you off, and I am very relieved that I can stop doing that. She laughed, because that was honest and slightly ridiculous and exactly like him, and then she kissed him with the sun warm on both of them, and the paintbrush blazing around them, and the creek making its constant gentle sound. And she thought that the practical problem which had brought them together, and the extraordinary luck of a man who decided to come to town on the wrong Tuesday, had combined to give her something she had not known she was missing until she had it. That fall, Kate wrote to Reverend Mills requesting that he send a letter to the land office in Austin, documenting the marriage and the joint claim. Reverend Mills did this, and also took the opportunity to include his own personal opinion of the 1875 homestead provision, which he called a legal instrument of questionable fairness and considerable damage to the families it purports to protect. The land office did not respond to his opinion, but they processed the claim without dispute. Harlan Pruitt, the cattle baron whose land accumulation had helped inspire the provision in the first place, was indicted that October for water rights fraud and removed from the county by a federal marshal. Kate heard about this from Dutch on a Thursday morning and felt a satisfaction she was not entirely proud of, but did not attempt to suppress. In the winter, George's mother, Eleanor Hayes, came to visit from Arkansas, which was an event that Kate had been quietly dreading, and which turned out to be the best week of the entire year. Eleanor Hayes was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 58 with strong opinions, impeccable manners, and an ability to see through pretense that she had clearly passed directly to her son. She had known within one dinner. She told Kate frankly on the second day of her visit that Kate was exactly what she had hoped for. Kate had asked what she had hoped for. Eleanor had said, "Someone with enough backbone to keep my son honest and enough warmth to make him happy. He can be very self-contained, which is a polite word for stubborn." Kate had laughed and said, "I am aware." Eleanor had patted her hand. "Good, then you will manage beautifully." She asked about the ring. Kate told her the story about George holding it out in the church in Dust Creek with the afternoon light coming through the windows. Eleanor had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I hoped it would go to someone like you. My husband gave it to me after a very hard year. He said some rings carry a kind of luck forward. I believe that." Kate had looked down at the ring, smooth and plain and warm on her hand, and believed it too. In the spring of 1879, just over a year after Kate had read the notice on Hector's door, she and George planted the south field together, a full 10 acres of wheat and kitchen garden, and she found that working the land side by side was a different thing entirely from working it alone. Not easier exactly, since two people also meant two sets of opinions about the best way to run a fence line, a debate they had every few months and which never reached a definitive conclusion. But fuller, richer. She had not expected to find in the daily work of a ranch the kind of intimacy she had always associated with more dramatic moments. But there it was, in the shared exhaustion of harvest, in the quiet of early mornings before the ranch hands were up, in the way they had developed the small private languages that people develop when they live closely and pay attention to each other. One evening in late spring, George came in from the north pasture with the look of a man who has been thinking hard about something all day and has decided to say it. He sat down at the kitchen table while Kate was making dinner and folded his hands and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly without worrying about whether the answer is what I want to hear." She put down the spoon. "All right. Are you happy?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had known for just over a year, who had proposed to her on the first day of a 3-day deadline and waited until the third day, not because she had asked him to wait, but because she had needed to come to it herself, and who had understood that without being told, who had given her the ring from his mother's drawer and flowers from the lower meadow and the space to be herself and the company to not be alone with it. "Yes," she said, genuinely, entirely, without qualification. "Yes." The relief in his face was real and unguarded and beautiful, and she came around the table and kissed him firmly, and he put his arms around her and held her in the kitchen with the sun coming through the window and the smell of dinner on the stove, and it was the most ordinary and extraordinary moment she could imagine. "I am happy," he said against her hair. "I know," she said. "I can tell." "How can you tell? You skip stones in the creek when you are happy." "You have been skipping stones a great deal lately." He laughed, which was one of her favorite sounds in the world. In the summer of 1879, they found out Kate was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning on the front porch over coffee, as straightforwardly as she did most things. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession, ending on the one she associated with him being moved by something, the quiet, serious expression that was not sadness but was related to it, the expression of someone registering that the world has expanded significantly. "When?" he said. "February, I think. Dr. Morrison in Abilene confirmed it last week." He reached across the porch table and took her hand. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "Perfectly well. A little tired in the mornings, but that is apparently standard and it is already improving." "Good," he said, and was quiet for a while, holding her hand and looking out at the ranch he had built and the land they had built together. "Kate." "Yes." "Thank you," he said, in a voice that was not quite steady. She understood what he was thanking her for, and she did not try to make it smaller or redirect it, because he was a man who did not often say things like this, and when he did, they deserved to land. "You are going to be a very good father," she said. "You cannot know that," he said, with the slight wariness of a man who does not like to claim things he hasn't yet earned. "I can know it," she said firmly. "I know you. That is enough." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his mouth, and she felt the warmth of him against her fingers and the morning sun on her face, and thought that she was, without question or reservation, the luckiest practical-minded woman in the state of Texas. They wrote to Alina in Arkansas immediately, and Alina wrote back within 10 days with a letter so full of emotion that some of the ink was blurred in ways that could only have been tears, and plans for a second visit in January to be there close to the birth. George's ranch hands, Eli and Sam, received the news with the enthusiasm of men who had been waiting for this for some time. Eli, who was 23 and had worked for George since the beginning, declared it the best news since the end of the drought. Sam, who was quieter, simply shook George's hand and said, "You done good, boss," which was, Sam being Sam, practically an oration. Kate continued to work the homestead through the summer and fall with the modification that George began, without discussion and without making a point of it, to quietly take over any task that required heavy lifting or sustained physical strain. She noticed this but chose not to argue with it, partly because it was coming from a place of genuine care, and partly because she was, in the second half of her pregnancy, grateful for the help, though she would not have admitted this to anyone but him. She did, however, argue with him about the delivery. He had decided they should go to Abilene, where Dr. Morrison's practice was, and Kate had decided the cabin was perfectly adequate for the purpose. They had a spirited debate about this over several weeks in which both positions were argued thoroughly, and neither party fully conceded, which ended in a compromise. They would stay at the ranch but send for Dr. Morrison well in advance, and Alina, who had delivered 3 children including George, would be present as well. "This is acceptable," Kate told him after they had come to this agreement. "It is the obvious solution," he said. "You could have suggested it directly instead of arguing for Abilene for 2 weeks. If I had suggested it directly, you would have argued for it being your idea." She opened her mouth, closed it. "That is fair," she said. He smiled, the full, warm smile that she had first seen on the day of their wedding and that had not lost any of its effect in a year and a half of marriage. Their son, Thomas William Hayes, was born in February of 1880, on a clear, cold night when the stars were extraordinary, with Dr. Morrison and Alina both present, and George holding Kate's hand with the white-knuckled grip of a man who is considerably more frightened than he is letting on. He was born healthy and loud, and with a full head of dark hair that Kate's father would have called a sign of stubbornness, which she thought was probably accurate. When George held his son for the first time, standing in the lamplight of the ranch house bedroom with his arms very careful and his face completely undone, Kate watched from the bed with the specific, deep exhaustion of a woman who has just done something tremendous, and thought that she was looking at the thing she had not known she was building when she set out from Missouri with Chester, and a deed and a dream that was not even her own to begin with. She had thought, the night she read the notice on Hector's door, that she was fighting to preserve what her father had left her. She had been right, but she had not understood the full size of what she was preserving, because the land had been the beginning and not the end of it. Thomas was healthy and grew quickly, and had his father's eyes and his mother's determined jaw and his grandmother Alina's sharp attention to everything around him. Alina stayed for 3 weeks after the birth and declared, on the morning she left, that Dust Creek was the best thing that had happened to the Hayes family since they left Ireland 3 generations ago, which no one had previously mentioned was a thing that had happened. Kate filed this information away with the particular delight of someone who is still finding new rooms in a house they have been living in for 2 years. The spring after Thomas was born, they planted the south field again, and this time Kate worked it with Thomas wrapped against her chest in the carrier Alina had brought from Arkansas, the baby sleeping contentedly against her heartbeat while she directed the planting. George worked beside her with the easy partnership they had developed, and the ranch hands worked the north field. And Dust Creek's most unlikely marriage turned out to be its most productive in that spring of 1880, both in wheat and in the particular richness of two people who have found each other and are paying attention to every day of it. In the summer, Clara Whitfield came to Kate with a legal problem. Her son had decided to leave the territory, and if his name was removed from the claim, her land would revert to the same provision that had nearly taken Kate's homestead. Kate went with her to Reverend Mills, who went with them to the county commissioner, and between the three of them, backed by a letter from George documenting his own case and the marriage arrangement that had been forced by the same provision, they argued Clara's case loudly enough that the commissioner agreed to look into an amendment. It took 18 months, but in the winter of 1881, the county amended the provision to allow widowed and single women to hold independent claims, making Kate's original ordeal technically unnecessary in retrospect. She stood outside the land office in the county seat on the day the amendment was posted and felt something she recognized as the feeling of things being set right, which was different from the feeling of winning. It was quieter and more complete, and it lasted longer. George was beside her when the amendment was posted, because he had ridden the 40 miles to the county seat with her, as he did most things without being asked. "Your father would have appreciated this," he said. "He would have," she agreed. "He would have been insufferable about it," George laughed. "I hope Thomas inherits that too. He is 17 months old. He is already insufferable about most things." "He comes by it honestly from both sides," George said, and she took his arm and leaned against his shoulder as they walked back to their horses, and the sun was warm and the road was long and they had everything they needed. In 1882, their second child, a girl they named Eleanor Frances, after both grandmothers, arrived in the summer with considerably less drama than Thomas's February arrival. Healthy and sunny-tempered, and utterly convinced from her first weeks of life that the world was an interesting and welcoming place. Eleanor Hayes wrote that she was not surprised by the name, but that she had cried for an entire morning anyway, and that she was coming in September whether they invited her or not. They invited her. Thomas, who was 2.5, greeted his sister with a mixture of suspicion and cautious fascination that George told Kate reminded him of how he had probably greeted the notice on Hector's door, which was not an analogy she was going to explore at length. The ranch continued to grow. George expanded the herd to 60 head in 1882 and took on a third ranch hand, a quiet young man from San Antonio named Ricardo, who was 20 years old and the best horseman any of them had ever seen. Eli, who had been with George since the beginning, built himself a small house on the property with George's blessing and material help, and married the schoolteacher from Dust Creek's new schoolhouse in the spring of 1883, and Kate gave her a blue ribbon from her mother's sewing box as a wedding gift, and cried a small amount when she thought no one was watching. George was watching, but he did not say anything about it, which was the right call. He had learned, in 5 years of being married to Kate Rhodes, that there were two kinds of her emotions. The one she named and shared directly, which she did with an openness that still sometimes moved him with its clarity. And the ones that slipped out when her guard was down, which she found slightly embarrassing and did not want remarked upon. He honored both with equal care, which was perhaps the truest expression of how well he knew her. She had learned, in 5 years of being married to George Hayes, that there were also two kinds of his emotions. The ones he expressed plainly and directly, usually when something mattered enough to override his natural quietness. And the much larger category of feelings that he expressed entirely through action, through the fence he repaired, and the flowers from the lower meadow, and the careful grip of her hand in the dark of a February night, when they were both frightened and pretending not to be. She had learned to read both vocabularies, and found that together they were a richer language than either alone. In the winter of 1883, when Thomas was 3 and Eleanor was 1, and the ranch was prosperous, and the homestead claim was full and producing. Kate sat down one evening after the children were asleep with a piece of paper and her good pen, the one she used for letters, and wrote to the land office in Austin. The letter was not a complaint or a petition. It was a detailed account of the events of April 1878, told plainly and in full, documenting the harm that the 1875 provision had done to women like her and Clara Whitfield, and advocating for a full statewide amendment. She did not expect it to be answered. She wrote it because she believed that the record mattered and that the women who came after her deserved to know that someone had spoken. The letter was answered 5 months later by a clerk who told her that it had been forwarded to a committee, which she took with the healthy skepticism of someone who knew how these things moved. But the committee did eventually move, slower than she would have liked, with less force than it should have had, but it moved. She kept the clerk's reply letter folded in the wooden box on the mantel, the one George had brought to the dinner table their second night, and then seemed to forget about, which had turned out to contain, when she finally asked, 3 letters from his father written in the last year before he died, and a dried sprig of something she did not recognize, and he told her was from a particular hillside in Arkansas that his father had loved. She kept her clerk's letter there too, and thought of that box as the place where important small things lived. By 1884, Dust Creek had grown. A new street was added, and with it a hardware store, a proper doctor's office, and a small but genuine school that Thomas attended beginning in the fall of that year, driving him in the wagon while Eleanor sat between them demanding to know why she could not come too, a debate that was conducted at some volume every Tuesday and Thursday morning. "She is too," Kate told her daughter firmly. "You will go when you are older." Thomas went, Eleanor pointed out, which was technically accurate and logically sound, as Kate acknowledged privately. "Thomas is 4, Kate said. "I will be 3, Eleanor said, with the air of someone who considers this a compelling counterargument. "This is your fault," Kate told George over Eleanor's head. "I take full responsibility," he said, utterly unrepentant, and kissed Eleanor on the top of her head, and Eleanor beamed at him with the sunny certainty of a child who knows exactly how beloved she is. George was the father Kate had told him he would be, which she allowed herself to feel satisfied about because she had been right. He was patient and present, and he had the particular gift of taking children seriously, meaning, he listened to them as he listened to adults, with real attention rather than the performative attention of people who are waiting for the child to stop talking so the real conversation can resume. Thomas, who was introspective and watchful like both his parents, responded to this by talking to his father at length about things that interested him, which at 4 included horses, the behavior of cattle, a book of stories Kate had brought from Missouri, and an ongoing philosophical inquiry into why Chester the mule was slower than the ranch horses, which George handled with considerable seriousness. Eleanor, who was a different creature entirely, responded by being in constant physical contact with both parents, climbing George whenever he was stationary and sitting in Kate's lap whenever Kate sat down, and somehow managing to convince both of them independently that she was the particular favorite, which was either very clever or simply the natural result of being Eleanor. In the spring of 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Eleanor was nearly 3, Kate found herself standing again at the lower meadow by the creek, in the same place where the Indian paintbrush bloomed, and where she and George had sat that summer afternoon, and she had told him she loved him. She had ridden down alone that morning, just before the rest of the ranch woke up, in the habit she had maintained through all the years of getting time to herself in the early morning to think and look and be quiet. The paintbrush was in bloom again. It blazed in the low morning light, orange red and extravagant, exactly as it had every spring since she came to Texas. The creek ran over its stones with the sound she had been listening to for 7 years. The hills to the west were the same pale gold. The sky was the same wide Texas blue. She thought about the notice on Hector's door. about the 72 hours and the bench outside the store, and the man who came to town on a Tuesday he had not intended to, about the wildflowers held in a careful hand and the ring from a mother's drawer, about the conversations at the Red Lantern and the cornbread and beans Dutch had put between them without being asked, about the fence he had repaired and the stone he was always skipping, and the way he said her name. She thought about her father, who had dreamed this land and given her the dream, and about her mother, who had taught her to make curtains from blue muslin and given her the ribbon and the ring she now wore on her right hand alongside the smooth gold band. She thought about Thomas at school and Alina at home, and the third child she had not told George about yet, the one she suspected was coming in the late fall, the one she would tell him tonight over dinner. She thought about what it was to come from nothing to something, not from nothing in the material sense, because she had never been nothing and she was not foolish enough to pretend otherwise, but from alone to together, from uncertain to settled, from a woman with a deed and a deadline to a woman who knew exactly where she was and why she was there and who was there with her. She had won, she thought. Not against the land office or the provision or the men who made the rules, though she had won those things too, in the long, slow way that unjust rules sometimes get unmade. She had won in the way that mattered most, the specific and irreducible victory of a life that was genuinely good, built with her own hands alongside the hands of a man worth trusting. She heard hoofbeats behind her on the soft ground of the meadow, and she turned, because she knew the sound of Smoke's hoofbeats as well as she knew anything. George pulled the gray gelding up beside her and swung down from the saddle with the easy movement of a man who has been doing this his whole life, and he stood beside her in the morning light, looking at the paintbrush and the creek and the hills, and he did not ask what she was thinking because he had learned that she would tell him when she had finished thinking it. She was finished. "I come here sometimes," she said, "and I think about the fact that all of it started with a notice on a door." "In my version," he said, "it started before that. I know." She turned to look at him, this man who had come to town on a wrong Tuesday and offered to help a woman he barely knew and held flowers in his hands like they were both practical and precious, and who had been right when he said that marriages were not always what they started as. "In my version, it started on the bench outside Hector's store, where I was being completely practical and not at all hopeful. And now," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile he had first seen in the candlelight of the Red Lantern on the night he had told her about Tuesdays, the smile that was entirely hers, unguarded and direct. "Now I am not practical at all," she said. "Now I am completely and entirely hopeful about everything." He laughed, and the sound of it went up into the morning air and scattered, and he reached out and took her hand the way he had that first evening at the bookshelf, palm against palm, fingers laced, the warm, smooth gold of the ring between their hands. "I have to tell you something tonight," she said. He looked at her. "Tonight, over dinner, I am still working out how to say it. Is it good news?" She looked at the Indian paintbrush blazing in the morning light, at the creek running over its stones, at the hills going gold and the sky going blue, at the man beside her who had proposed to her on the first day of a 3-day deadline and waited for her, without pushing or rushing, until the third day, because he understood without being told that some things needed to arrive on their own terms. "It is very good news," she said. He did not ask what it was. He held her hand in the morning light and waited with the same patience that had always been his great gift. And she stood beside him and let herself have all of it, the land and the love and the long, beautiful, improbable life they had made out of a notice on a door and a man who came to town on a Tuesday and a woman who had been told she had 3 days and used them, all 3 of them, exactly as she chose. That evening, after Thomas was in bed with his book and Alina was finally asleep, Kate told George over the kitchen table, with the lamp burning low and the smell of dinner still in the warm air, that they were going to have another child in November. His face moved through that sequence she had memorized by now, from surprise to stillness to the deep, unguarded warmth that was his truest expression of the things that moved him most. He stood up from the table and came to her, and she stood too, and he held her with both arms, solid and warm and entirely present in the way she had relied on for 7 years. "November," he said. "Late November, Dr. Morrison thinks. Thomas will be 5. Eleanor will be 3. He pulled back enough to see her face, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes on hers. "You are well, you are feeling well." "I am perfectly well," she said. "Better than well." He kissed her, warm and certain and without hurry, and she kissed him back with the full, uncomplicated pleasure of someone who has long since stopped finding reasons to wait. "What should we call him?" George said. "You are assuming it is a him." "I am hoping," he said, which was honest, and then, "I am equally happy either way," which is also honest. "I know you are," she considered. "If it is a boy, I would like to call him Robert, for your father." He was quiet for a moment. "Robert," he said softly. "If it is a girl," she said, "we will argue about it for 6 months and both be satisfied with the outcome." He laughed and she laughed, and Robert Hayes was born on the 23rd of November, 1885, in the ranch house in Dust Creek, Texas, on a clear cold night with his grandmother Eleanor's gold ring on his mother's finger and his father's hand steady in his mother's, and the stars very bright over the Comanche Creek Valley. And he was healthy and loud and dark-haired like his father, and had his mother's particular expression of focused determination from the very first moments, which everyone agreed was a very good sign. Thomas, who was now 5 and considered himself an expert on younger siblings, examined the baby with the gravity of a judge and announced that he looked pretty good, which was, Thomas being Thomas, high praise. Eleanor, who was 3, declared immediately and without hesitation that Robert was hers, and proceeded to take a proprietary interest in his welfare that lasted for the rest of their shared childhood and considerably beyond it. George stood on the porch the morning after Robert was born, in the cold, clear air of November, with the sun coming up over the hills and the ranch beginning its morning sounds around him, and thought about his life in the way that a person sometimes does at moments of fullness, not with nostalgia, but with the clear-eyed recognition of where you have been and where you are and the specific grace of the distance between them. He had come to Texas because the land in Arkansas was full of other men's expectations, and he had needed to find out who he was outside of them. He had spent 4 years finding out, and he had liked most of what he found. He had come to town on a wrong Tuesday, and a woman with dark red hair and a practical problem had changed every estimate he had made about his life. He heard her step behind him, and he did not turn, because he knew her step the way he knew the creek and the cattle and the sound of smoke in the morning. And she came and stood beside him on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders and coffee in both hands, and gave him one of the cups without a word. They stood looking out at the land in the morning light, the land they had built together out of a deed and a deadline and the particular luck of a man who decided to come to town on a wrong Tuesday, and neither of them spoke for a while, because neither of them needed to. Inside the house, Thomas was awake. Kate could hear him moving carefully so as not to wake his sister, who was asleep with one hand resting on the edge of Robert's cradle, as if even in sleep she was keeping watch. Robert was breathing the deep, complete breath of a very new person who has arrived in a world that will, without question, turn out to be full of good things. "Good morning," Kate said at last. "Good morning," George said. The sun came up over the Comanche Creek Valley, and it fell on everything equally, the ranch and the homestead and the lower meadow where the Indian paintbrush would bloom again in spring, and the creek that ran over its stones with the same sound it had always made, and the 2 people on the porch of the house they had built together, and the 3 children sleeping inside, and all the days that were still ahead, long and various and full. It was, Kate thought, as she had thought on the morning of her wedding, and on the day her first son was born, and on every ordinary Tuesday morning in 7 years of a life that had turned out to be entirely extraordinary, the most beautiful place she had ever seen. And standing beside her was the best reason she had ever had for staying.